Thanks, Garrett. I think that was a brave and commendable attempt at all the names, personally. Good morning, everybody. Good to see everybody here. So we're entering a sermon series on the Book of Kings, specifically the story of Elijah. Bethany's been doing this for a few weeks now. But obviously with Travis, departing, he had some parting sermons for us, and that's what we've been listening to. And so we're jumping into Elijah's story, sort of mid-story. And just to give a quick note, because sometimes I'll use the term Yahweh to refer to God, familiar to a lot of us, but perhaps not to everyone. Yahweh is the name that God gave the Israelites as his covenant name. When you see Lord in all caps in your Bible, or you see I am, that's what's reflected in the text, but out of respect wasn't translated literally. So when I say Yahweh, that's who I'm referring to, just so we're on the same page. But before we jump into this particular text, I want to contextualize kind of what's happening in Elijah's story, what's happening in the Book of Kings at large, because it can be one of these long, sort of maybe unapproachable books, feels a little boring at times, right? Like ancient historical annals. But it's really not when you can capture the drama of everything that's happening. So the Book of Kings is a historical annal written as a theological explanation of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. It traces roughly 450 years of history of the kingdom of Israel from the end of David's reign through his son Solomon to the division of the kingdom through civil war into north and southern kingdoms. Israel is the northern kingdom, Judah the south, until Jerusalem is finally conquered by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar several hundred years later. And the history takes place in a period of ongoing uncertainty and war, political intrigue. The rulers of the small, globally irrelevant nation of Israel are confronted by global superpowers such as the Egyptians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, as well as other nation-states in their more immediate neighborhood. Megan, if you want to pull up that map to kind of give everybody an idea of what we're talking about here. So we've got these global superpowers and nation-states nearby, all with their own political agendas. It's sort of Iron Age Game of Thrones, and Israel is the small fish in the pond. And so Israelite kings play politics to survive their neighbors, and it's a zero-sum game for them. A wrong step by any of these kings meant captivity or death at either the hands of one of the superpowers or one of the nations nearby. And that's only if they could survive internal coup attempts and assassination attempts that happen regularly. It's a very unstable period in Israel's history. And in the background of this story unfolding, of this history unfolding, we hear stories of prophets of God, such as Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and others, inviting Israel's rulers through all this uncertainty to trust him, and not political alliance, not economic pull for deliverance. Kings in this period lasted as short as 7 days in the case of Zimri of Israel, or as long as 55 years in the case of Manasseh of Judah. And the Book of Kings provides commentary, characters, and story all centered around one primary question. Did this king actually follow and trust Yahweh as their protector, their sustainer, their provider, or not? And consistently, kings are judged as either they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord or they trusted in the Lord. Manasseh, as we mentioned, ruled 55 years, an incredible achievement in his time given the political realities that he faced and the struggles that he had to navigate. He managed to keep the land safe and prosperous for more than a generation. And in the Book of Kings, he gets 18 verses, all outlining the ways in which he abandoned Yahweh. So you can see the book is unforgiving in its assessment against this one single metric. Did you follow Yahweh or not? And the answer for all but a handful of the 42 rulers whose lives are documented in this book is no. All but a handful, the answer was no. They did what was evil in God's sight, and it ultimately leads to the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians. So what's happening? So that's big picture Book of Kings. Now what's happening in Israel during our passage? King Ahab rules the northern kingdom of Israel at the height of its power, following his father Omri. He secured an alliance with Syrian and Phoenician states, 12 total, all the small guys getting together, against the superpower to the north, Assyria, ruled by a guy called Shalmaneser III. I'm keeping that name for our boy if we have one, Megan. To maintain their territory and have control over trade. And so Ahab has organized power and alliances to control wealth and create prosperity and security. Simultaneously, the fundamental faith of the people of Israel in Yahweh is under threat. Ahab married a Sidonian princess. Sidon's up there to the north. We can keep it. Sidon's up there to the north. Ahab married a Sidonian princess named Jezebel to secure an alliance with her father, King Etbaal. And part of that agreement was, like Jezebel and the Sidonians, Ahab and his people must worship the god of the Sidonians and of that whole region, actually, Baal or Baal. It means Lord in Ugaritic, a language that they spoke way back then. And so for the sake of power, security, and the ability to control the wealth and trade that goes through this very critical region in the world, Ahab agrees to this alliance. He marries Jezebel. His court floods with prophets of Baal like politicians and generals ahead of a coup. They all commend his choice and affirm, God is on your side. He supports this. You're doing the right thing, Ahab. And then Jezebel, in quick order, orders that all the prophets of Yahweh be put to death. And so truth and God in the kingdom are relegated to politics, power, and money. Truth and God are relegated to politics, power, and money. Enemies are controlled and dealt with, the law of the land and the power behind it. The king, who is meant to be among the chiefest of God's representatives to the people of Israel, is actively erasing Yahweh from the public's consciousness, the very God who created their nation through miraculous deliverance out of Egypt, through passage, even through the Red Sea. But to Ahab, Yahweh was expendable. Why? He had a kingdom to run and practical things to take care of. So then Elijah enters the scene, a prophet of Yahweh in times of apostasy, conflict, and death. We don't get much on his background except he's from some nowhere called Tishbe, a place never mentioned before, never mentioned after. But during Ahab's rule, he breaks onto the scene as this one guy who's still loyal to Yahweh in troubled times, one of a few, one of only a handful. God directs him to confront Ahab with a demonstration of his ongoing sovereignty and power, and Elijah tells Ahab there's going to be a multi-year drought in the region until God says otherwise. You see, Baal, this god that Ahab started to worship, god of the Sidonians, was revered as a god of power and fertility, bringing vegetation and food to his people. Through Elijah, Yahweh confronts that notion directly. It's gods versus gods in their world, ultimately. And the prophets on all sides are meant to represent their God's interests. So instead of Zuckerberg versus Musk, it's Yahweh versus Baal to see who's the true power in Israel. The drought lasts 3 years. We learn Ahab has been sending men to scour the land looking for Elijah, but unsuccessfully the whole time. But then at the proper moment, God tells Elijah to go confront him again. And so Elijah shows up on his doorstep, this person he's been looking for, confronts him again about his worship of Baal and refusal to obey and trust Yahweh, and challenges him to have Jezebel bring all of her prophets, numbering over 800, to Mount Carmel. It's modern-day Haifa in Israel. Beautiful place, worth visiting. For a demonstration of Yahweh's power on top of a mountain. 2 sacrificial bulls are prepared. You may be familiar with the story. 2 sacrificial bulls are prepared, and he challenges all these prophets. He's one person against 800, and he says, we'll prepare these sacrifices. You ask Baal to rain fire down to consume the sacrifice. I'll ask Yahweh to rain down fire and consume the sacrifice. Baal's prophets beg Baal for hours, mutilating themselves even to get his attention, but to no avail. And yet, sure enough, it is Yahweh who answers. Elijah's bull, drenched in water to prove the point beyond a shadow of a doubt, is consumed by fire from heaven. The common people who are all watching, this was a spectacle, are amazed, and they fall to the ground, crying out that Yahweh is the true God. The prophets of Baal are seized and executed. Rain pours from heaven to relieve the drought. And at this moment, if you're Elijah, you're thinking disaster has been averted, right? The kingdom is saved, and worship of Yahweh, along with all of its benefits, his protection, his covenant love, is restored in Israel. All would be right now. But it's not. And that's where we leave off and get into our text, chapter 19, verse 1. So Ahab leaves, and it says, when Ahab got home, he told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, including the way he had killed all the prophets of Baal. Verse 2. So Jezebel sends this message to Elijah, may the gods strike me and even kill me, if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you as you killed them. To paraphrase this common swearing expression or oath-making expression, you will die tomorrow, Elijah, and if not, may the gods kill me where I stand. May the gods kill me where I stand. It is a stark oath to take and to send, and a stark message to send to Elijah. So Jezebel and the prophets of Baal defeated, she doubles down, raging like a mad dog. And as I said, this type of swearing was not done lightly. In her mind, either she dies tomorrow or he does. And that's how seriously they took it. Verse 3 outlines Elijah's response. Again, he's come from the mountaintop, an incredible victory, to now, verse 3, Elijah was afraid, and he fled for his life. And he went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. Then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, for I'm no better than my ancestors who have already died. And then he laid down and slept under the broom tree. So we get a view into Elijah's state of mind. From triumph and victory to terror. Consider the contrast. He's had this incredible mountaintop, literally, faith moment that he exhibited. This incredible victory, this incredible moment of trust and deliverance from Yahweh, the highest of highs, if you can imagine. And yet, his chief enemy still remains, and she intends to send an army to hunt him down and kill him in less than a day's time. The reality of that sets in, and despite the amazing deliverance God provided, Elijah thinks, I could be dead tomorrow. He's afraid, and he flees. He goes to Beersheba, a town as far south as south goes. So up here, this is where he came from. Roughly Haifa is up here. Flees all the way down to the southern tip of the kingdom of Judah in Israel, to the southern tip of the kingdom of Judah in Beersheba. He goes as far south as south goes in the kingdoms to escape Jezebel. And it's in the middle of the desert, a most hospitable place, I can personally attest. It is hot and dry, and there is nothing but dead desert hills. And so he goes to Beersheba, he flees, he isolates himself. The text reads that he leaves his attendant, this guy who was following him in town, presumably to protect his life, because he's sure that he's going to be killed. And then he wanders into the desert. He finds a tree and he waits to die. I gave everything that I had, but it wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. I'm not good enough. I've had enough. Kill me. I'm no better than my apostate fathers before me, because in the end, what I did didn't matter. This is what's going on in Elijah's mind. Baal still reigns in our kingdom. Ahab still worships him. The people are still going to follow what Ahab says is their king, and they're pursuing me to kill me. And then he lays down and waits to die. And so Elijah goes from this faithful servant to suicidal depression, the highest of highs to the lowest of lows. In verse 4, it literally reads, the Hebrew text, and he asked of his soul to die. He asked of his soul to die. It's a stark moment. It's a stark moment. And we wait in the text to see how God is going to respond. And so what does God do with this prophet, dejected, downcast, sleeping in the shade under a tree in a desert with nothing, waiting to die? Cheer up, Elijah. The fruit of the Spirit is joy. Is that what he says? Does he condemn him? You're just not believing hard enough, Elijah. Does he warn him? Depression is the devil. You let him in. I've heard people say stuff like this. This is not coming from a vacuum. What does God do? What is God's response to Elijah's state? Suicidally depressed. Verse 5. But as he was sleeping, look, in the text, look, an angel touched him and told him, get up and eat. Elijah's probably startled by this. He looks around, and there beside his head is some bread baking on coals and a jar of water. So he eats and drinks, and then he lays back down again. So God visits Elijah in his despair and comforts him with basic necessities. No obligations, no demands, just sustenance. And this angel, this visitor, is the second messenger, malach in Hebrew. He's received in the text. The first malach was sent by Jezebel. The first messenger was sent by Jezebel, brought a threat of death. This messenger brings him food. As he wanders in the desert and is miraculously fed by food, we recall how Israel was provided for in the desert in their 40 years of wandering, God providing manna. So Elijah eats, drinks, lays back down, and was totally better. No. Although we might expect, if we were in his shoes, having been visited by this messenger of God, by this angel in the text, we might expect this grand revival. Elijah lays back down under the tree. He goes back to the state he was in, waiting to die. Verse 7, then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him and said, get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you. So Elijah gets up again. He eats and drinks, and it says the food gave him enough strength to travel 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai. Some texts may read Mount Horeb. It's the same mountain, two different names. The mountain of God. And there he came to a cave where he spent the night. So we have this repetition in the text. Angel visits again, rise, eat, plus now new information, because your road is long ahead. You need to be strong for this journey. The first time eating was enough. As Elijah gains strength, the messenger shares this new information. You've got a long way to go. You need to eat this. He ate, drank, and literally walked in strength all the way to Mount Sinai. If you want to go to the next slide. Roughly 200 miles. Beersheba is roughly here. 200 miles southwest in the most inhospitable terrain you can imagine. Sinai Desert. We can imagine that the meal provided was akin to something like lembas bread for you Lord of the Rings fans. Enough to get him that way, enough to get him that long, because going roughly 5 miles a day, that's a 40-day journey. I mean, it's a long way. And so he walks in strength all the way to Mount Sinai. And so Elijah is experiencing this from the highest of highs down to suicidal depression, the lowest of lows, to slowly, incrementally coming back, right? And the text, from our perspective, we as readers, we're invited to compare him and to compare this journey actually to Moses. He spends 40 days and 40 nights in a desert as Moses and Israel wandered for 40 years. We see Elijah in the same desert, and then he arrives at the same place that the people of Israel arrived after the Exodus, Mount Sinai. Again, Mount Horeb in some of your translations. Israel is in crisis in Elijah's time, and the text diverts us as readers back to Moses, a leader also chosen by God to deliver his people out of crisis, who led the people through the desert, who were sustained miraculously by manna, who went to Mount Sinai to hear from Yahweh, where he enacted his covenant with him, that same covenant that is now under threat by the action of Israel's rulers, Ahab and his wife Jezebel. This is not lost on Elijah. So Elijah is experiencing a moment of utter dejection, depression, and loss. And simultaneously, we see God weaving a bigger story for him. And we're intended to compare him to Moses in this moment, to remember the things that God did for Moses, and to look at what God might do and continue to do through Elijah, even if he himself is not aware of all that is happening. His experience, Elijah's experience from his perspective, doesn't match the overture that God is writing with his life, at least not yet. We move in the text to a famous mountaintop scene on Sinai. And the term for encounters like the one that Elijah has is it's called a theophany. That's the word that Bible scholars use. That's the big word. It means God showing himself, God actually encountering somebody directly, and where he enacts something in specific historical people in specific historical communities. It includes several elements, usually something disruptive of natural forces such as a storm, wind, something, an earthquake, fire. It includes an utterance of God who is present in the context of this disturbing circumstance that asserts the presence, the self-identity, the sovereignty, and most often the commands of God. God shows up, crazy things start to happen, and he says something. Whoever he is speaking to usually is afraid and responds in obedience to God. And that person or community is radically redefined by the visit. And then there's usually an indication that the encounter has changed everything. You can compare it to the burning bush, right? Here's this bush on fire, not being consumed. God speaks. Moses is radically transformed, and then we get the Exodus story. Isaiah chapter 6, he's transported to this heavenly throne room of God. He describes these indescribable things as best as he can, is commissioned by God as a prophet for other kings in this book of Kings, Ahaz and Hezekiah in his case. And then he's radically transformed. Perhaps the paramount example is the encounter of the people of Israel and Moses on Sinai. God tells Moses to go up to the mountain so that he can speak with him and give his word to the people. And then thunder and lightning and horn blasts happen. A dark, dense cloud hovers over the mountain. Smoke billows in the sky like from a searing hot brick kiln. That's what the text in Exodus 19 says. There's earthquakes. The mountain shakes violently. Horn blasts grow louder. Yahweh beckons Moses to come in and says, don't let anybody else in or they'll die. This is the presence of God being manifested through these happenings in the natural world. Our passage, I mention this context because our passage is in conversation with these events and is in contrast to these events, as we'll see. Verse 9, and the Lord said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah replied, I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty. Another translation says, with absolute loyalty I have served Yahweh. But the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you. They've torn down your altars and killed every one of your prophets. I am the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. After ministering to Elijah's specific physical needs, we now have a conversation. And I want to point out, we don't get to this conversation, this moment of God encountering Elijah directly without what happened in verses 3 through 8. Without those moments of sustenance, of encouragement, of getting him back up on his feet. So Elijah puts his trouble into words to God. The problem as he sees it. I have been uber zealous for you, Yahweh, and yet what has it accomplished? The people have still abandoned you. Your altars are torn down. Your prophets are dead. I am alone. In Elijah's mind, I have failed. I have failed. So I might as well die. There's nothing left for me to do. God responds, go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by. Again, same word used when Moses was passed by on the mountain by God. A mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, shaking the mountain, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper, or sheer silence, as another translation puts it. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And so as the people of Israel have abandoned their covenant, God invites Elijah to meet him in the very spot where that covenant was first made. And then there's an epic, catastrophic scene. A strong, great wind tearing mountains and breaking cliffs. One translation puts it, a very powerful wind went before the Lord, digging into the mountain and causing landslides. Then an earthquake, just like in Sinai. And then fire, just like at Sinai. But in contrast to these other moments of God visiting his people, the text says the Lord was not in the earthquake. He was not in the wind. He was not in the fire. And you can pause and ask, but instead he's in this sheer silence, this whisper. And you can pause and ask, who is this in Elijah's life from his perspective and experience? What is powerful in his life right now? The powers that be. King Ahab, who had solidified his power in the region by marrying Jezebel and worshiping Baal. The prophets siding with him. And yet God was not in these powerful things that Elijah is encountering. Rather, in contrast, Elijah recognizes his unmistakable presence in a whisper, in sheer silence. And God says, in other words, as I have revealed myself in fire and storm and earthquake, which is what Baal does. If you read the Ugaritic text back then, describing Baal. He's a thunderstorm, that's what it says. But as I have revealed myself in these things, God says, so now I'm a whisper, and very much alive and well, Elijah, even in these darkest times. I remain, even in just the minority. In other words, no, Elijah, you're not alone. And then after that encounter, Elijah is asked again the exact same question. What are you doing here, Elijah? He replies with the exact same response, word for word, that he gave before. I serve the Lord. The people have broken their covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've killed your prophets. I alone am left. And I want to point out that amidst these incredible happenings, amidst this encounter with God, he repeats his protest. He repeats his problem. He doesn't say, no, you're too wonderful to comprehend, God. Thanks for visiting. I'm yours. Compare the lament message last week by Pastor Richard. He, of course, has reverence for God. Elijah, of course, has reverence for God, but does not drop his petition or whitewash his experience in the name of piety before God. And I just want to encourage you, that is your heritage as well, Christians, we who inherit this faith from the prophets and psalmists. Elijah repeats his petition, and then God responds in verses 15 to 18. The Lord tells him, go back the way you came, travel to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive there, anoint Hazael, then anoint Jehu, and then anoint Elisha, who's going to replace you. In other words, I have a plan, God says. I have a plan. I still have a people. I am not dead. Elijah made the mistake of thinking that he was indispensable, God's last and only hope. By announcing these successors, God is making clear that he's not without recourse. He hasn't lost. Hazael, the king he mentions, will be God's judgment on Israel later in the story. Jehu will become king of Israel and bring God's punishment on Ahab, who's abandoned God for Baal. And Elisha will continue the work of Elijah. God is active and working and alive, even though Elijah could not see it. Even though Elijah could not see it. So I want to leave you with a couple of reflections from this passage. Number one, God sees you in your depression, in your suicidal ideation, in your lowest of lows. He does not reject you. He does not judge you. You're not doing something wrong. He is here for you. Even if you don't feel it like Elijah didn't, even if you don't see it as Elijah didn't, he is here for you. And if depression or suicide is something you struggle with, I cannot encourage you enough to seek help, to share with people you trust, and seek the help of professionals, licensed counselors, your doctors. Elijah did not feel his life was worth living. Literally, he asked of his soul to die. He was done. He was finished. He said, I failed. And God disagreed. Living in depression has the nasty habit of feeling like there's no way out, but it's not true. Your life is valuable, and you are valuable. And with that, sometimes the best thing we can do for someone in a state of depression is the first thing. Sometimes the best thing you can do is the first thing, a meal, cleaning their house, helping with some errands, driving them to an appointment, fill in the blank. We are all in process. We are all in process. And God recognizes this. He didn't spurn Elijah for his reaction. He ministered to him. He ministered to him. And you don't get this mountaintop experience, this theophany, this God meeting Elijah in incredible, miraculous ways without this first ministering to him first with food and water and encouragement. Hey, eat some more. You've got a long way to go. Indeed, we see a grand revelation of God on the heels of suicidal depression. So tell me again what sort of person you have to be for God to work utterly miraculously through your life. I think we put so many burdens. We burden the concept of what it means to be somebody who is chosen by God, somebody who God uses to minister to the world. We have this habit of idealizing. But when we read this story, Elijah, this chosen person of God, who has chapters of the Bible written about him, was not an ideal person at all in this sense. He was a flawed person to the point that he wanted to die because of his failure. The patterns of success of this world are not reflected in the lives of the prophets, of God's chosen people. They are people who are simultaneously and inextricably tied to the people of God on one side and God himself on the other. And because of that, when you read about their lives, when you read stories like that of Elijah, you see that they live lives of pain. And our passage this morning makes clear, you do not have to make yourself well for God to speak to you. He had compassion on Elijah in a place where Elijah had no hope. What Stephanie was talking about this morning. And just as Jesus said before he ascended into heaven, I'm with you always, even if you don't see it. We see that God was weaving a bigger story with Elijah's life that he couldn't see. 40 days in the desert, sustained by miraculous bread, meeting God at Sinai. There was a pattern he was following, and he didn't even know it at the time. Elijah began our passage defeated and lost, and he left having heard from God, I have a plan. I have a plan. And I feel this as I wonder about our country, about the weaponization and politicization of God and his followers for the purpose of those who seek power and wealth, just as Ahab and Jezebel did. God was a mechanism to get what they wanted. And I see that unfolding here. People using God as a mechanism to get what they want, power and wealth. I resonate with Elijah in this passage as I dread the unfolding reality of climate change that's happening, something that's on my mind a lot. I look with sadness ahead at the fact that my daughter's life will likely have lower quality than mine because of it. And as enough progress isn't made fast enough, I resonate with Elijah's state of mind in this passage. Well, I failed. We failed. What's left? And yet, I simultaneously find courage that as God met him in his need and unfolded his plans before him at the right time, so he too will meet us in ours, even against the darkest backdrop, because that's what Elijah was living in, an apocalypse as he viewed it. And my final word is this. Megan, you can come up if you want. Be wise. Be wise in these troubled times. Well-funded and very active groups are vying for your attention, your vote, your rage, your fear. They often promise security, peace, and prosperity in the name of God if you'll only trust them, if you'll only follow them. Kings is a book that tells of rulers who faced that decision, that exact choice, again and again and again, amidst threat, turmoil, uncertainty, deadly politics of the region. Prophets, even prophets proclaiming to represent Yahweh, are in contention about this throughout the book of Kings as well. You'll see a king, and here's a group of prophets saying, no, everything's fine, you're doing the right thing. Make that alliance with Assyria. Make that alliance with the Sidonians. And then you have a prophet of Yahweh like Elijah, like Isaiah, like Amos, confronting them saying, no, if you do this, it will lead to destruction. Even though it makes sense, even though it feels like peace and prosperity and security. Like Manasseh, ruled for 55 years, yet did evil his whole reign. But even the greatest of the rulers we discussed, you probably hadn't heard of most, if not all of them, until today. Despite all their success, despite their political and economic cleverness, Manasseh ruled for 55 years, but you probably didn't know who he was until today. As followers of Jesus, we are invited into his kingdom. We're granted his citizenship, as Paul puts it. We're citizens of heaven. And its benefits, the benefits of being in the kingdom of Jesus, the benefits of being citizens of heaven, far surpass, and outlast the temporary, fleeting nature of contemporary politics. Never forget, as we live in a continuing and building milieu of people claiming what God wants from political platforms, never forget that Christ himself was invited and nearly forced to become a ruler in his time. They wanted to force him to become a ruler to set things right. And he refused. Why? For a better and more lasting kingdom. Don't give up Christ in the name of political achievement. Don't exchange your mercy, your love, your care for immigrants, your compassion for promises of power, peace, and prosperity. That is exactly the deal that Ahab made. Exactly the deal. And the book of Kings details that those who did that led to the ruin of Israel. Those who made that deal. Power, peace, prosperity. Elijah wielded power, fled power, and felt powerless. God appeared to him not in power, but in a whisper. Even though, as we discussed and as he demonstrated, he had power over all. Don't fall for the trap as men and women masquerade as saviors who can grant you power and prosperity. It is fleeting at best. As Andrew shared, a couple weeks ago, eternity is so much longer. It's so much longer. He comforted Elijah that there remained a small but significant number of faithful in his troubled times, a remnant, as it's often called in Scripture. I have a remnant. So we too can take comfort that we are not alone in our pursuit of God, the truth, living rightly as he gave us an example to live, most clearly through the life of his son, Jesus. Let's sing together. Please stand as we sing.
This is a gospel song that I just love the image of it. And so as we read this story, maybe take time to ask God to remind you of a place where he met you, where God met you, and where you felt his love and presence. And we'll just make it a prayer. There